Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Rebecca Mansky. I'm with Monthly Review Press. We really, truly are unbelievably honored to be publishing Michael Heinrich. I mean, we're supposed to say that, right? But sometimes we feel that way more than others. It's kind of obvious why we would feel this way about publishing this extremely well-known book at this point. Karl Marx, you know, an introduction to the 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital, and then more recently, How to Read Marx's Capital, which is a really kind of like step-by-step engagement with Capital page by page. And this very rich biography, which is what we'll be focusing on today. This is the main subject today, but of course we can always refer here and there to other books that Heinrich has offered us. Guys looking for the Heinrich of that? Okay, come on in. Welcome. And I'm going to hand this over to the Marxist Education Project. I'm very glad that we were able to kind of work with you guys on this. It's been a little while since we've had the chance. And also very appreciative to the People's Forum, which is where this is hosted. Just so you know, there are limited copies downstairs and they're 50% off, which is obviously a great bargain. Hopefully people won't snag them on the way in, and there will still be some left by the time you leave. But otherwise, if not, you can become a Monthly Review subscriber, and then you get quite a deal if you become a subscriber. 40% off of all books. So, welcome everyone. And I'm going to hand it over to Marcus.
Hi everyone, I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, www.marxedproject.org. Make a note of that and join us for future events and classes. We're very happy to be co-sponsoring this with Monthly Review and enjoying the facilities of the People's Forum. I think Rebecca has already pretty much introduced Michael, who we're very happy to have. And the format of this is going to be just quite informal. As you can see, we have about 20 participants online in a Zoom session who will be also encouraged to take part in the conversation once Michael has made an initial presentation. And it looks like we're out of chairs here. I'm going to go see in a moment where we can, if we can find some more. Or if you have an empty chair, hold up your hand or let us know. Very happy with the turnout tonight. So let me just turn it over to Michael to talk for a while about the Marx Biography Project. And someone in the back can't hear.
Well, okay, if you want to come to the front, I can switch places with you, and also we'll all speak as well.
The acoustics in here were better than that, but anyway. So I'll talk for a while about the project, and then we'll just start open for your questions and comments. I will note that Michael needs to leave to catch a train at about 7:45, so we will have to wrap up promptly at that time. So, Michael Heinrich, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm really happy to be here. With Monthly Review, I've published several books, but I never was here. I never saw face-to-face someone from Monthly Review, only online. So, today I will speak about this biography, Karl Marx and the Birth of the Modern Society. When you see the front page, you will recognize a picture of Marx which was only discovered a few years ago. He was a student in Bonn, and a friend of him did this picture, gave it to the museum in Trier, and I was the first biographer who could use this, who was allowed to do this, but was a very nice thing. Now, I said already I was the first biographer to do this, what implicates there are many other biographers of Marx. I'm not at all the first biographer. I counted around 30 big biographies. I don't talk about short introductions of 100 pages, introduction in life and work of Marx, but really big biographies with 500, 600, 700 pages. I found around 30, 32, not counted the Chinese biographies, which I cannot read, but I know that there are also some Marx biographies. And of course, the question I'm always confronted with is why? We have so many biographies, why another biography? And why a multi-volume biography? Why I originally I wanted to do 3 volumes, then I realized, okay, it will be 4 volumes. I hope I can stop this 4. Why this? Okay, the existing biographies of Marx, they show big differences, not only in the political attitudes of the authors. Some are Marxists, some are anti-Marxists, but also in the quality of biography. And there is a tendency among most of biographers just to copy a lot of material from older biographies, to add 1-2 points, but to take, without really checking, a lot of material from older biographies, and so legions and mistakes are transported again and again in the biography. I learned never trust a biography. I don't use a biography as original source. When I find something interesting, then I try to check it. Can I really find a source, a document, and so on? But only because someone wrote Marx did this, said this, or so, this is not enough. So the first difference, I think, is that I'm much more meticulous with the material. And also you can see this when you check, for example, the literature list in this first volume. I used much more sources about these early years. The first volume covers only the time until 1841, when Marx delivered or finished his PhD thesis. So I deal with Marx's youth in Trier, with his family, and then with his study time, first in Bonn, in the German city of Bonn, what is not so far away from Trier, and then from his study in Berlin, what in this time was the capital, not of Germany, but of Russia. Germany didn't exist as a complete state in this time. Germany consisted in these times out of around 40 states, some extremely big and some extremely small. So it was a very specific construction. And Marx was a citizen of Prussia and went then to the University of Berlin, which counted as the best university in this time. So I bring more detailed information about these times, and I think also in the following volumes I can bring more information than we have in existing biographies. But this is not the only difference to existing biographies. Another point that I want to avoid any biographical fiction. In a lot of biographies, not only of Marx, also of other persons, the author describes how excited the portrayed person was when he spent alone the night before an important event. Yeah, okay. Where does he know this? It is the idea that when you are occupied with one person so intensively that you have a feeling how this person is thinking, how this person is feeling, and so you can narrate the story. I think this is nonsense. I never met Marx. I not even met a person who met him. So I studied, of course, a lot of documents, but to claim, oh, I know how he could think or feel, this is pure nonsense. So I avoid such biographical fiction. I try always to give very precise account which were my sources, what can we take for sure, what is an assumption I did using this and this sources, and also very often I stress we simply do not know. That something happens we do not know, and this will also be in the future volumes. However, the older Marx became, the more documents sources we had. And
Do you mind going a little bit further that way so they can see you?
yeah, I hope.
Or yeah, you go,
Yeah,
the little hesitant thing.
You can push me. I don't mind. So I try to avoid any biographical fiction. This is the second main point. And then the third point I stress is that, especially in the case of Marx, life and work are intertwined. Many biographies of Marx, it is mentioned that Marx wrote a Communist Manifesto, that he wrote Capital, or all the other writings, but it is more or less a background. The person is in the center, and then it is mentioned which texts he wrote. I think this is too less, because on the one hand, Marx didn't finish any of his bigger projects. He finished Communist Manifesto, but he didn't finish economic philosophical manuscripts. He didn't finish his first project, Critique of Political Economy. He didn't finish Capital. He didn't finish his very early project about Greek philosophy. Excuse me. Sorry.
Sit on the floor. I'm going to put you here as a marker. I'll go beyond there. So you should,
yeah, nice. So, in order to understand the dynamics of Marx's work, why he didn't finish, why he did start new, but with some differences in the theoretical coordinate system, you must know something about his life, something about the conflicts he was involved, something about what he aimed as an answer or as an intervention in these conflicts. So in order to understand this sequence of unfinished project, we need the life. But the other way around, it is also true. The life was influenced by Marx's theoretical achievements. He had new insights which touched questions of strategy, questions of alliances. So old friendships broke, new friendships or new political alliances emerged. And this was, in parts, a consequence of his theoretical work. Insofar, the development of the life, the development of the works are interconnected. And insofar, I wrote, I need the English, the life of Marx and the development of the work. And both are equal. So it's not the life with some hints to the work. Both is equal. And in this first volume, extensively, I deal with Marx's dissertation, what usually is not, at least not so in such an extent, done in other biographies. But there are also other differences to biographies and justifications for my project. Another biographer, Jonathan Sperber, who published a Marx biography, I think in 2013, stressed a lot that Marx is a person of 19th century. He used this implicitly as an argument against Marx. Such a person of 19th century cannot tell us today anything what is important. The basic statement that Marx is a person of 19th century is not very surprising for someone who is born in 1818 and died in 1883. What else he should be? But what is this 19th century? It is the century in which industrial capitalism spread, in which industrial capitalism transformed the society. It is the century where the modern bourgeois state emerged. It was not completed, this bourgeois state. It had also developments in 20th century, but there is a big difference when we look at states in the 18th century and in the 19th century. And Marx was a very clear witness of these processes. And he was also an instance of reflection. What does it mean? Insofar to say, oh, he's a 19th century person, this is a banality. We must check what did he observe? What was this 19th century? Insofar, I have not only a little bit historical background, I go really in detail. What was the situation in Prussia? What were political conflicts? How the economy will develop? This in the next volumes will become more decisive. Marx lived in different cities after he left Trier and his parents, and each city has a specific characteristicum and influenced Marx in a specific way. He went to Berlin. Berlin was the political capital. It was the city where the Prussian king was, where the government was, where a lot of political administration was. Then he went to Cologne. Cologne was a big trade center. Here he had contact with a progressive bourgeoisie. This was something completely different from what he experienced in Berlin. From Cologne, he went to Paris. Paris, what was called the capital of 19th century. He had a kind of internationalization. A lot of emigrants from different European countries were in Berlin, in Paris. In Paris, he also for the first time met elements of an organized workers' movement, a much more advanced discussion about socialism than he saw in Germany. So each of these cities, and I don't want to continue, but I think you it's clear what I mean. Each of these cities had a special influence on Marx because it gave the possibility to specific experiences. In order to understand this, I must go into detail. I must explain what is Berlin, what is Cologne, what is Paris, and so on. But also, it's not only the cities, the environments, it is also the persons. In many Marx biographies, the critics of Marx, the opponents, or the friends of Marx, they play only side roles. You have the big, the portrait person in the center, and the others are only at the side. And very often the others are viewed through the eyes of Marx. Perhaps when you read the book Holy Family, the first common book between Marx and Engels, Bruno Bauer is criticized with a very devastating critique. He is criticized. The critique is continued in German ideology, and when you read only this, then you must think, oh, Bruno Bauer, he must be a very mediocre person, so stupid you cannot even imagine this. But this Bruno Bauer, between 1837 and 1842, was the closest personal friend of Marx and the closest political ally of Marx. So he cannot be so stupid, so simple as the later critique implies. In the biography, already in this first volume, I focus a lot on Bruno Bauer and on his own thinking, what was occupied with the philosophy of religion. Now maybe you will say, okay, philosophy of religion. Young Marx played no role. No, philosophy of religion in Prussia in the 1830s was an extremely political issue. Not only because Christianity was so widespread. The Prussian state defined itself as Christian state. The Prussian king was the head of the Protestant church in Prussia. So every issue of religion, of church, itself was highly political. It is often said, this early criticism of young Hegelians, they changed to the field of religion because it was not such a direct critique like you criticize the state. I think this consideration is completely wrong. It was political, and the critics had to pay the price. They were expelled from the university. They couldn't do a university career. So it was not an easy field. And Marx was much more involved in these discussions than, I must admit, I knew before I started with this biography. And Bruno Bauer was an important person in this field. In the second volume, I will even go one step further, and I will show that especially Bruno Bauer, in these years around 39, 40, 41, was the representative of a kind of revolutionary republicanism. So, revolutionary thinking started for Marx, started not only when he became a communist in 43, 44, it started already in 39 or 40. We have no direct documents of Marx that he wrote something, but he was so close with Bauer. They wanted to publish commonly a journal that we can imagine the revolutionary, this Republican revolutionary position of Bauer in these times was also the position of Marx. So this changed somehow the ideas about development of Marx, but this was a spoiler for volume 2. In volume 1, I didn't go in detail to this. So, in general, I take a lot of attention to the persons, but not through the eyes of Marx, not through the glasses of Marx. I try to do research about the persons themselves and try to find out what did they really do themselves. Okay, now I think I described a little bit my general framework, what I want to do. I also, this you will find no other biography about Marx. I wrote a methodological appendix. I wanted to make clear to the reader what I am doing, what are my guidelines, so that you as readers not only can understand, you also can criticize what I'm doing. But now I want to stress also some points, some content of this first volume. A big deal of the material deals with Marx's use in the city of Trier. Usually it is said, oh, we know nearly nothing. Marx didn't leave any diaries. There are no reports from the persons who shared school with him. You have nearly no direct sources, but I checked very meticulously the situation in the city of Trier, the teachers of Marx, and also I checked possible friends from his youth. In an old, was it Francis Wien? I'm not sure, but one biographer wrote, yeah, Marx's later theory of alienation is a reflection of his isolation as a pupil in Trier. He had no friends, he was excluded from everything, so it was very clear that such a theory of alienation fits to him. I try to show that at least 6 persons we can suppose were close friends to Marx in Trier. And also we have the fact here, we have really a document that when Marx in the second semester in Bonn was a student in the summer 1836, he was the president of the union of students who come from Trier. Okay, when you are elected as president of the union, you cannot be so isolated. So many stories of Marx's use, or I think it's fake. I tried to follow this a little bit more close. Also, I did a lot about his father, Heinrich Marx, and also his later father-in-law, Ludwig von Westphalen, the father of Jenny. Both very interesting figures, and both very influential for the young Marx. The second point, which I dealt with in this biography, are 2 well-known facts, but until now, nobody saw a connection. The young Marx liked very much to write poems, and he did this extensively. He reworked this, and when he studied in the first semester law, he must have, as a first idea, he presented to his father that he wanted to find a publisher for his poems. So, yeah, I have a double job. So, this poetry for Marx was important, but since Franz Mehring, who wrote the first serious biography, it appeared 1918 to the 100th anniversary of Marx, he wrote, yes, Marx had some ideas, it was a youth idea with the poems, but very quickly Marx realized that he has no talent and he let it, and we must not occupy with this. In his biography, he not even included one of these poems. I would say it has for Marx much more importance, and it has had consequences. The second fact, which is well known from Marx's letter to his father he wrote in November 1837, was that Marx, the young Marx, first was hostile to Hegelian philosophy, but then he felt forced to join in a certain way Hegelian philosophy. Also, this is well known. In my first volume, I tried to show that these two events, Marx gave up his poetry, Marx joined Hegelian philosophy, that they are strongly connected. Marx's ideas about poetry, in my view, I try to make it plausible. It's a suggestion. I have some indications. I have not a full proof, but I think strong indications. Marx's early poetry was influenced by the early progressive romanticism. The early romanticism favored French Revolution, and they wanted to have poetry not just as a medium to transport some messages, like it is very often the case with political poetry nowadays. Instead of writing an essay, people write a poem and want to deliver a certain message. The idea of this early romanticism was that with poetry itself, you can change the world. You can make the world poetic, and that this already has an effect. When Marx was in Berlin, it was not to avoid that he read Hegel, and there, on the one hand, in Phenomenology of Spirit, and on the other hand, in the lectures on aesthetics, Marx could find a devastating critique of the beautiful soul. The beautiful soul was an important part in Hegel's critique of Romanticism. The beautiful soul, it doesn't want really to be connected with the things. It doesn't want to become dirty, we would say today, but nevertheless, the beautiful soul want to show what is the correct way in this dirty environment. And I think Marx had to admit that he is such a beautiful soul, or he was in these times. And so he fought with this critique of Hegel. I could show this. I don't want to go in more details here, but he couldn't really resist. He had to accept this critique, and this meant he had to give up his poetry, not because he thought, oh, I have no talent, but Heinrich said, and many biographers copied from a 19-year-old author to say, oh, does he really has talent or not? It's a little bit early. So I think he gave up poetry because the political ideas which he connected with poetries, they were destroyed by Hegel's critique of the beautiful soul. So the end of his poetry was influenced by Hegel. Now Hegel was Hegelian philosophy was the point he had to discuss this, and he didn't find a way out. He was driven by his own logic in the direction of Hegelian philosophy. Insofar, what all the biographers know, Marx stopped his poetry, Marx moved to Hegelian philosophy, I think is the same process. It is not two different processes. It is one movement, and I think this was not seen before I published this first volume. The other point from the content I want to mention is Marx's dissertation. It was his first big work. Marx, as a youngster, of course, he had big ideas. He wanted not only to write this dissertation about two old Greek philosophers, Democritus and Epicure. It should be the starting point of a serial of texts discussing Greek philosophy. Not even this first part, the dissertation, was published. And what looks on the first view as an exercise in the history of philosophy had a very direct political impact in two aspects. On the one hand, Marx discussed post-Aristotelian philosophers, and he parallelized this with the situation after Hegel's death. When you have a philosopher like Aristotle, or later like Hegel, who encompassed all the history of philosophy, all in some respect who gives a system for the human knowledge. How is philosophy possible after such a system? And there is a parallel. How is philosophy possible after Aristotle? How is philosophy possible after Hegel? This was the one point. The other point, what was very important in his dissertation, was the relation between philosophy and religion. Epicure was attacked already in the ancient world as someone who doesn't respect the gods. Epicure didn't say he didn't has an atheist position saying, oh, the gods don't exist. He said the gods are in their own world, they don't care about the humans, and why we should care about them. And this was, of course, criticized in the ancient world, in the medieval world. So there was this conflict, philosophy and religion, and exactly the same conflict Marx saw in his times. Hegelian philosophy was attacked as being not a Christian philosophy. And already Feuerbach, Ludwig Feuerbach, discussed this point and said, okay, to ask for Christian philosophy is the same as if you would ask for a Christian geology or a Christian mathematics. Either it is a science, and then it plays no role. It's senseless to say it's Christian or not Christian, or it's not a science. But when philosophy is a science, so the criticism it is not Christian is just nonsense. So it was this seemingly essay about old Greek philosophers was a political intervention. And this political intervention was clearly expressed in the preface of this dissertation. A preface, I suppose, he didn't send to the university committee. It was a preface for publication. And there he said, Prometheus is the most important holy position because he expressed what is the motto of each real philosophy. I hate all the gods. So Marx was very direct in this preface, showing the political content of this dissertation. In the literature, very often it is discussed in his dissertation. In his dissertation, was he?
Okay, I'm sorry.
In his dissertation, was he still an idealist, or was he on the way to materialism? So you can, in some way, put an order in the contributions to Marx's dissertation. Do they say idealistic, half idealistic, or even materialistic? I think this is completely nonsense. In many discussions about idealism or materialism in this early Marx, we use a term of idealism and materialism which was created in the second half of the 19th century. It was not the term used in the first half. For example, nowadays it is totally in use to say Hegel was a part of German idealism. Walter Jeschke, a very brilliant expert on Hegel in Germany, he published 20 years ago, I think, a nice article, When German Idealism Emerged. And the answer of Walter Jeschke is, it emerged in the 1860s, 40 years after Hegel's death. It is a product of the writing of the history of philosophy. I checked here for this first volume, contemporary encyclopedias from the 1840s. And it was said in several encyclopedias, of course, Hegel is not an idealist. Kant and Fichte, okay, they construct out of the self the whole world. But Hegel, he knows about the world. He wants to understand the world. He's not at all an idealist. So I think there is a big confusion with these terms, idealism, materialism. In the first volume, I just touch this. In the second volume, it will be a more important point, because there we can see Marx himself stating materialism. I'm a materialist, or this is a materialist position. But here we have to look very meticulously, what does he mean with materialism? And it is something different from what is meant in the late 19th century. Another point, which in the usual literature is reproduced without questioning, is the difference between old Hegelianism and young Hegelianism. It is since, I guess, Karl Löwit and other researchers from early 20th century, it is taken for granted that the Hegelian school dissolved in two wings, a conservative old Hegelian wing and a progressive young Hegelian wing. But when you look in this time, both terms were used. However, the old Hegelians were not at all a school. It was, this word was meant as in the sense old-fashioned. Oh, they do this old stuff, but it is not a school. The young Hegelians first was used by the opponents. It should be a bad word against them, and then they started to use it by themselves. But they also didn't form a school. It was more a kind of tendency to use Hegel's philosophy and turn it politically. Bruno Bauer, this I will, again a spoiler from for the second volume, Bruno Bauer turned this. He, in 1841, in his text, The Last Trumpet, he tried to show, and I think he's rather good, that Hegel himself was a revolutionary, and Bauer says he was much more revolutionary than all his pupils. So what I question in my biography is also this old model. You have the Hegelian philosophy, and it's split in these two schools. Marx was in the young Hegelian school, and then he overcame this school and founded his own school, or came to his own positions. The real story is much more complicated and much more interested than this schematic way. So now, just give me 5 minutes. I talked about methodological framework of the biography. I said something about the content of volume 1, so that you know when you buy it what you buy. And I did some spoilers from volume 2, and I will add some more spoilers. In volume 2 of the biography, I continue with the story of Marx. Immediately after he finished his dissertation, he left Berlin. He had no money. He went to his family, then he went to Bonn. He hoped to get a university position in Bonn with the help of Bruno Bauer. But Bruno Bauer already was in a situation that the government wanted to kick him out of the university. They did something, or the Ministry of Culture and Education. They asked all the theological faculties in Prussia, is such a guy like Bruno Bauer able to teach theology when he is such a critic of religion? This never happened before. It was really a discussion point, an everyday discussion in Germany among the more educated citizens. It was not a small point. So all this discussion about religion theology proved to be very political. For Marx, it had the consequence he could forget every idea to have a university position, and he did what many persons of his generation did. He became a journalist. But he became not only a journalist, very quickly he became a journalist who published in a rising newspaper, which quickly became a leading oppositional newspaper, Rhenanian newspaper. And after a few months, he even became the chief editor of this newspaper. And again, a few months later, the government shut down this newspaper. Perhaps some of you saw the movie by Raoul Peck about the young Marx. it starts with this shutting down, but totally wrong. Perhaps you remember this dramatic scene. The editors in a room, oh, what shall we do? Marx, the hero. Let the police in. I want the fight. He opens the door, the police come in. They were bound and in a wagon transported. So you have the feeling there was already the fight between Marx, the revolutionary hero, on the one side, and the reactionary Prussian state on the other side. Nothing is true from this story. It's completely fake news. To shut down the newspaper, it was a bureaucratic act. The government sent a letter in January. With the end of March, you have to stop the newspaper. So they had 2 months in order to come to an end of business. In a very nice bourgeois slang. Nobody was arrested. No policeman knocked at the door. It was, and this was not even an extreme ordinary thing. A newspaper need a license, and the state just refused the license and gave enough time that they could finish business. After this, Marx went to Trier, where he married, after biblical 7 years, his fiancée Jenny von Westphalen. And there he met a high Prussian official, Esser. Now I forgot his prename. The second name was Esser. He already had met him in Berlin as a student. And this guy, very high Prussian civil service man, offered Marx to become an editor in the state newspaper. So in this time, the Prussian state was not at all against Marx. They said, oh, it's a very clever guy, an intelligent guy, maybe a little bit radical sometimes, but let's give him a job in our newspaper and see how things will develop. All Marx refused. But what did Marx in his newspaper, in the Rhenania newspaper, he criticized the Prussian state, but in which sense he criticized? He tried to show what is a modern state. And in order to be a good modern state, you need, for example, the liberty of press. Only by the liberty of press, the government can get knowledge about the problems. When you restrict the press, the government doesn't know which problems occur. They cannot react. So the liberty of press, free press, is not a kind of moral value, oh, respect the opinion of others. No, it is a necessity for a modern state. Insofar, Marx, in some respect, we can say, tried to educate the Prussian state. And the Prussian state was not hostile to Marx. They tried to integrate him. It is really completely the opposite story, what is insinuated in the movie of Raoul Peck.
Michael, I didn't want to interrupt you because you were so interesting throughout that whole delivery, but do you want some water? Would you like some water? Some water.
I have
You have
some
some water?
water.
I also wanted to adjust the camera a little bit because people are they're looking at a ceiling and it seems a little bit more interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. So go ahead.
So this is one issue I'm occupied with in the second volume. Another issue, what is very important for my second volume, is Friedrich Engels. No Marx biography can ignore Friedrich Engels, of course, but I not only ignore him, I think at the end I will deliver at least a small Engels biography as included in the big Marx biography. And in this second volume, I have a long chapter, printed pages, about 120 printed pages, I estimate, about the use of Engels before he met Marx for the first time in 1842 in Cologne. It's extremely interesting and fascinating. Both Marx and Engels, they came from bourgeois families, but Marx from a so-called educated bourgeoisie. They could have a career by a good education and then a good position in administration. Engels came from an economic bourgeois family. There was a family company already in the third generation. And the father of Engels, he took him out of school 1 year before the final exam. Why? That Engels, the young Engels, should never have the chance to enter university, because he needed this final exam. But Engels fought back. He did his military duty in Berlin. And what is very usual for a nice class state like Prussia, for the poor people, military service was awful. 3 years of pressure. The rich people had the possibility of the voluntary 1 year. It was shorter. They had to pay themselves for all the things. The state didn't give them dresses or guns or so on. All this they had to pay. But it was said, yes, these young persons from rich families, they are in the process of education, so we let them proceed, and the military duty is reduced to a minimum. Engels did his military duty in Berlin, and the 1 year of military duty was his year at the Berlin University. And this was an extremely interesting year, because Schelling, this reactionary philosopher, came in this year to Berlin. Engels was in his lecture, and Engels was the first, really the first, who wrote a devastating critique of the lecture of Schelling. The text is called what is Schelling and the Revelation. If you are interested in philosophy, you must know a little bit about Schelling. But if you are interested, I recommend this text. It is really a joy to read it. So he had Engels. He had a certain education. Before already he had experience as a journalist. When he was in his education as a merchant in Bremen, during day he was in the office, and during night he started to publish articles which were published in the most important German newspaper in this time. So in a time where Marx wrote nice poems, or in an age where Marx wrote nice poems, Engels was already a hard-boiled journalist. It's really fantastic. So this is another point. What I deal with, the young Engels, then I also, what is a reason for me to be so detailed with the history of Engels? I want to show why these two guys, after they met the second time in Paris, became so close friends, a friendship which lasted until death. And I think they were very different, but the differences fit together in some respect. If they were more close, it would be boring. But so it was interesting. Okay, time is running. Enough spoilers for the second. No. One, it's not a spoiler, just to tell this. Second volume. It will last until January 45. Only 4 years. I said the first volume, I stopped in 41. Second volume until 45, but it happens enormously in this time. The third volume, I want to come until the year 57. It is the year or the time, summer 57, before Marx wrote Grundrisse and started with these deeper economic manuscripts. And the fourth volume from 47, not until 83, the death of Marx, but until 95, the death of Engels. Engels as an editor of Marx, Engels who did this popularization in his late writings, is so important. I cannot write a Marx biography with this. And then it's a very thing very much in the future, not next year, not the year after. The last chapter of the last volume of the biography should deal with all the persons who met Marx and Engels personally, like Kautsky, Bernstein, and many others. Just to see it will be a rough overview what they did, how they were influenced, what they did with the heritage of Marx and Engels, where already some conflict, some confrontation started. This then should be the last chapter of the last volume, and I hope I will become old enough that I will see this last chapter. And with this I finish, and now we have time for discussion before I have to run quickly out here.
So the room is packed. I'm glad to see everybody here. We are going to try to manage the conversation with our Zoom participants and with you folks here in the room. So I would take one or two questions from the in-person audience, and then one or two contributions from the Zoom room, if there are such. So who would like to go first? Over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I appreciated it.
Speak up so the mic will catch you if you can.
I will. You mentioned how Marx wrote for his dissertation about post-Aristotelian philosophers and how that influenced his approach or relationship with Hegel's writing, correct? I guess, how much do you think in a similar way we today are in the shadow of Marx, and how we today can negotiate that?
That's a good question. Marx is dead, like Aristotle and Hegel, but I think this is the main parallel of the situation. We are not so beyond Marx. Of course, you can find a lot of persons who say, yes, now we need something new. We have a new situation, the computer society, the service society, all this and that, and we need something new. But a few years later, it is proved that the things are not so new. And with Marx, we are not at all finishing. What I didn't mention in my presentation, I couldn't do this biography without Mega, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, which is not only complete, but which is correct, and which has not only the works and the letters, but also the excerpt notes, where you can see how Marx himself worked. So, still our knowledge of Marx is limited. We have to discover Marx. It is not old-fashioned. And insofar, I would say we are in a different situation. It is not like post-Aristotelian or post-Hegelian situation. We are still in the Marxian situation and not the post-Marxian.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see anyone online yet with questions or comments, so let's go to the back in the green. Yeah.
This is very blue. Okay. Did Marx ever write about German unification? And if so, did he see it as progressive in any way?
German unification, it was not a big issue for him. He was not a representative of the nation state. It was more that he criticized this orientation to the nation state. He stressed class issues. And especially after 48, when it was clear German unification will come from Bismarck, meaning from the reactionary government, then it is not at all a project of emancipation.
Here.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the conceptual motivations for writing the biography, namely that a lot of biographers are just wrong because they made up things. But could you maybe talk a little bit more about the political motivations for focusing on the biography instead of your more conceptual work of Marx's thought, and also maybe what you hope to be the political implications of your research on Marx?
So you don't want to talk about Marx, now you want to talk about me.
Sorry.
Yeah, of course, I also have a political motivation. For this, I can say I have as well a motivation which rests in my biography, that when I occupied with Marx, and I'm occupied with Marx since I'm 14 years old, very early I started to see to stress the development in Marx. My master thesis in political science was about the change of the notion of capital from Grundrisse to Marx capital. It was always the development. In my book Science of Value, I extended this, and I had a little bit biographical background to understand the conflicts of in which Marx intervened and so on. The starting point of the biography, or that I thought about a biography, was rather accidental. That a good friend asked me which biography I could recommend. And then I thought, I can recommend no biography. And then I started, how would a biography look like so that I can recommend them? And I did some conceptual notes, and it became more and more. And I think that this accident that I was asked for a good biography had this consequence. It could have only this consequence because I was prepared for this. In the meantime, I would say all the texts of Marx, even the most theoretical texts, are political interventions. And in order to understand this, we need the biography. So we cannot talk about the work in total isolation from the biography. Of course, we cannot decide purely theoretical questions by the biography, but the biography helps us to understand why this question became important and this question became less important. Insofar, in the meanwhile, I would say we need such a biography. For me, it is also the chance to rework again my own occupation with Marx. For me, this biography is really a research project. It is not something at the end of my life I want to write down because until now I didn't have the time for it. No, it is for me the biggest research project I ever did. And this research project, of course, has a political meaning. I want to defend Marx in parts against his critics, but also against the part of the Marxists, which have a very simplified picture from Marx.
So there's a question from the Zoom participant, Jack. Since you mentioned that Marx had a more nuanced understanding of Hegel than as an idealist, in the same sense as Kant and Fichte, could you elaborate on how you think Marx understood Hegel's idealism and how his thought on this issue changed over time?
It's not completely correct. I didn't say Marx had a more nuanced understanding. I said in this time, the understanding was different. The understanding was not that Hegel is an idealist in the 1830s, 1840s. This was definitely not the state of the debate, and Marx followed this. For him, in the late 1830s, this difference, idealism, materialism, played not really a role. It is only we who impose this from our later questions. In the mid-40s, Marx criticized Hegelian idealism. However, we have to look which Hegel he had in mind. And it was a kind of young Hegelian Hegel. He was not a neutral historian of philosophy. He was involved in all these political debates about Hegel, the political debates of the young Hegelians. And there was a tendency always not only to criticize the position of the others, but to formulate such a radical critique to say, oh, you have not only a wrong position, your foundations are already wrong. You have no chance to come to a correct position because you are basically wrong. And then comes the next and said, yeah, your critique against him was good. But for you, it is the same. You are not only wrong in a certain position, your basics are wrong. There was a kind of always going deeper, always overwhelming the other. And in this context, I just put the name Ludwig Feuerbach played a role, not so much that now he introduced materialism, he introduced a certain critique of Hegel. Marx followed this to a certain point and later also deviated from this. Insofar, what Marx criticized in the mid-40s as idealism has to be critically examined. What did he mean? And not everything he ascribed to Hegel really fit to Hegel. So you will see in the following volumes, I will not just refer to to Marx's critique. I will also, in some respect, criticize Marx's Hegel critique.
Okay, next, let's go over here. Yes.
So this is sort of like a methodological question. I think I kind of understand the mega as a citational body, but when you're getting back into like before Marx was in college, that sort of thing, like I haven't read the biography yet, but I remember my friend telling me who was very amused that there's like a part where I think you compare like an essay that Marx wrote in class, and then somehow you compare also all the ones that his classmates wrote or that sort of thing. So, what sort of like record keeping, like was it the case that these schools just like had a big filing cabinet with like all the homework assignments like all the students, or like, I mean, even this thing about his status as like the president of the like students union or that sort of thing. I'm curious, like, where you kind of go looking for those things, or like what was the nature of the record keeping that makes us even have access to them in the first place?
Can you repeat the question briefly? So,
Okay, when I understood correctly, you say I bring a lot of details about school, not only the school essay of Marx, I also regard the school essays of his classmates in order to understand what is specific with him or about students, and where I do find all these sources. There is a huge literature about Marx, about certain detailed points in Marx, which is not very much known, which is also not used in biographical literature. For example, there is an investigation, or not an investigation, a publication of all these essays of his classmates from the final exam. I just had to use it. I searched for all this. It is in small journals. It is in a certain literature. A lot of this was done in GDR, in East Berlin, in East Germany. I have, since the 80s, I'm from the West, but since the 80s I have very close relations to the Marx researchers of the East and also of the former Soviet Union. And in so far, and also for 10 years, I collaborated with this mega project. So I have access, I suppose, to an enormous treasure of sources. And my problem is not that I have no sources or too less sources. My problem is how to handle this mass of sources.
okay, we mentioned at the beginning that Michael has to leave at around 7:45, so just let everyone who came in late know that for what it's worth. Let's go here.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the political and theoretical significance of the dissertation. In particular, I know some people have interpreted or accused Marx of being an Aristotelian essentialist in his early writings, in the way he talks about species being and labor for humans as a kind of essence of some sort. Do you feel like there's any particular content in the dissertation that was particularly important to the development of his critiques of contemporary society, or do you feel like he moved past that pretty fast?
No, I tried to already to give some hints that in the dissertation you can say you have two backgrounds. The one, this post-Aristotelian situation, which Marx parallels with the post-Hegelian situation, and this other element, the relation between philosophy and religion, that also the philosophy of Epicure was under attack from his older philosophers. It was especially Plutarch, and Marx wrote an appendix to the dissertation where he occupied with Plutarch. I don't know how it's correctly pronounced in English. And this point, philosophy and religion, was an extremely political point in the 1830s. So it was a direct intervention. Then later, how his opinions are formed, we have also to look what happened after the dissertation. This is also an important point. Some biographers, they try to find the one source, the one starting point where they can say, oh, from here everything becomes clear. Some argue even his essay in German studies in the final exam in school it shows already the marks of historical materialism. I think this is nonsense. There came a lot of later influences, and the old things were influential, but always reflected. They were broken by newer influences. Yeah.
And so, kind of building on that point, these discussions always seem to involve readings of the young Marx and what was the young Marx versus the old Marx, what was the old Marx. You've always stressed that there were multiple interruptions, ruptures, and breaks. In the first volume, you mentioned his shift from poetry and conversion to Hegelianism as one kind of epistemological break for him. How many would you say that there were in his career, and what were they? Are you planning to do maybe one epistemological break per volume?
This I cannot answer in the moment. I have not such a strict rule, one per volume. Maybe there are even 2 or 3 per volume. I said here already in the introduction of this volume that this old conflict, do we have a continuous development of Marx, or do we have a discontinuous development, a young Marx in distinction from the late Marx, that I criticize both positions. The continuity is refused by the many changes, theoretical important changes we find. The break thesis, at least when it is one break, the young and the old Marx, I think is wrong, because the many breaks, the many shifts, the many changes, you cannot just focus in one or maybe even 2 big breaks. You have to see that the development of Marx is multidimensional. In the one dimension, let us say philosophy, there was a big break in a certain year about essence of human and human species and so on. But in other fields, for example, looking to certain political questions, there was continuity. And then later there was a break in his political views, while the epistemological views developed continuously. And in so far, the development of Marx is much more complicated, but also much more interesting than this simple continuity or the simple break thesis says.
Right here.
Yeah, so we've talked a bit less spoilers for volume 2. So you've talked about like Bauer, Feuerbach, Hegel. I'm wondering what the sort of first appropriation of political economy looks like in the 40s. Yeah, how you're going to tackle that, to what extent?
Marx, as he himself noted in the preface of 1859, said as an editor of the Rhenanian newspaper, he was first forced to come to economical issues. This is on the one hand correct, but this occupation was in some respect superficial. He just learned, oh, economy is also important. What was for his theoretical, early theoretical formation important were the contribution, on the one hand, of Moses Hess, with whom he was very close in the years 44, 45. A lot of people saw 3 persons close together: Marx, Engels, Moses Hess. They formed a kind of unity. And Moses Hess wrote an article or a book about the money system. And probably Marx read the manuscript of this book between writing the first part and the second part of Jewish Question. And when you compare these 2 parts, they look completely different. And the question of money is absent from part 1, but central for part 2, and it is not prepared somehow. So something must have been happened, probably the reading of Moses Hess. And the other important influence was Friedrich Engels, with his outlines of a critique of political economy, published in French, German yearbooks, what was edited by Marx and Ruge. And then it was published early 44, and then also in Paris, Marx met Proudhon. And he was also influenced by Proudhon, who had much more economic knowledge in these times than Marx himself. By the way, this is another stupidity of the movie of Raoul Peck. There, Marx met the first time Proudhon and formulates questions which you can find in Poverty of Philosophy, which appeared 3 years later. So as if the young Marx already had this criticism in mind. But before this criticism, he was an admirer of Proudhon, and only then he learned that also Proudhon had his limits. But for the young Marx, Proudhon was also an important influencer for economic theory.
I think you've had your hand up quite a while. Go ahead.
Given that Marx's thinking around ecology has become a topic of some debate recently, I'm curious if you've gotten any fresh insights from your work, particularly on this first half of his life.
In the first half of this life, I would say it played not a really crucial role. It played a role in Engels' early book about the condition of the working class in England, because there he described the misery of the working class, and a part of this misery was the housing situation, the living situation of the working class in a totally polluted environment. Engels stressed this. Marx, of course, read this and had knowledge, but it had not immediate consequences. But when you read the first volume of Capital, there you can find at the end of chapter 15 in the English translation, chapter 13 in the German original, the chapter about machinery and great industry, the last paragraph says that all the progress in capitalist use of technology, of science, undermines the two sources of wealth, the human labor force and the nature. So there was a clear idea, but it was not really expanded to a theory. In his later excerpts from the 1870s, late 1860s, 70s, he was more occupied with this. And an author, Kohei Saito, who did in Berlin his PhD about these issues, he published a nice book, also appeared with monthly review, where he tried to use this material and to show that if Marx would have completed Capital, he would put ecological question, or the word didn't exist in these times, what we call today ecological questions, in a more central role. And okay, Kohei is very engaged in this. Perhaps one has to be a little bit more cautious, but the direction of the argument I completely support.
So he's been waiting for some time.
Yeah, why don't we take one more question so make sure Michael can catch his train and
Sure.
not miss it. So you got about five or 6 more minutes. Go ahead.
So I sense kind of a tension in your biography that maybe is true of most biographies, which is between this thinking of Marx's work as basically grounded in his life, and his life is sort of symptomatic in some sense of his time, So I'm wondering if there's a tension there between that idea and the other sense of Marx being an exceptional figure, or sort of sui generis, and how do you divide between what, I don't know, say belongs to Marx, or to what extent is he doing something explicitly creative?
Yeah, it is both. What is, I think, the case with many humans. On the one hand, you are grounded in your time, and the times are changing. So to understand in which respect Marx is grounded, we need to know about the time. For example, when we read the young Marx, the style of the young Marx is totally different from the Marx in Capital. And people are very impressed. But when you are occupied with the time, you know this is a very typical style. What maybe for us seems a very genius-like style, is it not at all. It only reflects that we don't know what were the times. But when we know this, then we also can detect and where Marx was able to transcend his times, where he went further. And I tried to show both, where he was grounded and what were the points where he really achieved something which maybe nobody else achieved in his times.
Michael, would you like to say a few words to wrap up, or should we just close here? Or
yeah, I'm very sorry that I have to leave, because I saw more fingers here, more questions, and
When is volume 2 coming out?
when volume 2 is coming out. No, I have now to catch my. I hope it will come out next year. Okay. So, okay, I thank you very much for your attention, for the interest in this project. And if you have a very urgent question, you also can send me a mail, and I will try to answer. So, and also the same for the persons who joined online here. So, goodbye.
okay.